My name is Melanie Thomas. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I will make a plug for my department. We have changed quite profoundly. We now have very deep expertise in gender and politics and Indigenous politics. And yeah, so I mean, I know it's tempting to judge us on our emeriti, but that's not what we are. Like Duncan, I am originally from Alberta. I grew up literally in the middle of nowhere, southwest of the city. My mother was a registered nurse working at the facility in Lethbridge that also was blown up in the early 90s. And while some will make the argument in Calgary that it wasn't necessarily that catastrophic in Lethbridge, it really was. This is when we create a genuine healthcare crisis in the southern portion of the province. And so as the daughter of a registered nurse, I remember that very well. And I think this is where a lot of my political awakening initially came from. What I want to do here is to talk about the things that make me nervous about Alberta politics and the things that I think about how we see elections in Alberta that actually give me genuine anxiety, because I think we need to start thinking in these terms so that we can head off certain rhetoric at the pass and actually work hard to build democratic norms that we simply don't yet have here. To do this, I'm going to give you a brief recap of what happened in 2015. And I will preface this with the fact that I'm teaching an entire course on electoral behavior this term. And so in that sense, I've got 13 weeks to break every preconception and unfounded and empirically unsupported assumption that all of my students have. And I have 13 weeks to do that. I'm going to do my best to do a little bit in 10 minutes here with everybody here. The first thing that we need to talk about is economic voting, and how the economy mattered in 2015, and understanding that will help you understand what will happen in 2019. Economic voting is always phrased between incumbents and challengers. And so this is the idea is that when the economy is strong, incumbents are rewarded. When the economy is not, incumbents are punished. It's one of these theories that is neutral or the way the effects of the economy are neutral to whoever happens to be in office. The ideology of whoever's in office, it really is challengers versus incumbents. The kicker for this as well is that most of the time, when voters are looking at the economy, the economy that they're evaluating for economic voting is the collective social economy. It typically isn't their own personal pocketbook. And this is because most people are sensible enough to know that if they don't like their bank account balance, they may have a role to play in that. But when you're talking about the collective economy, that's usually when we start to look at the government and what they're doing with these sorts of things. The other thing that they look at is where they think the economy is going to go. So if you're looking at May 2015 and like empirical economic indicators, the economy's not bad, but media reports are telling us that we're about to go off the cliff. And so this is what voters pay attention to. They look at anticipated change in the future collective economy. We know this was terrible in 2015, but we also know that this was terrible in 1993, back when Klein became the leader of the Progressive Conservative Association of Alberta, and they managed to win that election in 93. So there's other things that happen as well. So economic voting is a story, and we're seeing how the trajectory in that narrative is changing now. So mark that well. Good economy helps incumbents. This is always how that works. What else happened in 2015 rather? Alberta's a populous place, and I realize with what's going on sometimes in Europe and south of the border, we think that populism is a dirty word, but if you look at our political history, the prairies have always been a populous place. It cuts across the entire ideological spectrum, and prairie populism literally is that you advocate for the people against the man or the power that be or whatever. And across the ideological spectrum, people will define the people and the powers that you want to advocate for the people against in different kinds of ways. But I mean, Rachel Notley won because she was a populist, because she spoke up for the people. And it was like, there was the budget that nobody liked, all these other sorts of things. It was kind of this idea where there was ample fodder for that to be a populist kind of thing, but she was the only leader that capitalized on that. And so here you've got prairie populism and leader evaluations. Everybody really liked Rachel Notley a lot. So you get the context of the economy, where the incumbent is going to be punished, and then you have a party where they're actually well placed to take advantage of this with a leader that basically brought the party along, and this is how you get 2015 and the Alberta NDP government. It's worth noting that Alberta has a long history of one-party dominance. It didn't start in '71, it started pretty much as soon as we joined Confederation. But what makes 2015 unique in this context is that this is the first instance where the party that beat a long-standing incumbent wasn't an insurgent or a new party. So if you look at the social credit, they were new in the early 30s. They won the first election in 1935. If you look at the PCs, they were new in the late 60s. They won government in 1971. The Alberta NDP has been around since the NDP has been around, and the CCF before that, right? So this is one of those things where a number of us looked at this and were like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, so that's the context for 2015, and I'm pretty sure the context is going to be the same for 2019. It's going to be about the economy, it's going to be about prairie populism, and like the late Jim Prentice, I'm pretty sure Jason Kenney doesn't actually have a populist bone in his body, and so this is the sort of thing that I will highlight for you when you're thinking about how you speak to an Albertan in a way to persuade them. The idea about how you're advocating for the little person in the context of the powers that be is a narrative that matters here. And so this is why, at least in this context, I look at the word populism and I'm not worried about that. It's something that you need to know. Here's the part that makes me worried about Alberta. It's a concept called losers' consent. And this is a fundamental democratic norm, and this is core to our system. We shouldn't be looking at democratic legitimacy from the perspective of the winners. We need to look at the people who aren't winning elections. So we all want to win elections because when you're the winner, you get your greater share. If you're an elite or if you're a citizen, winning an election usually means that you get a greater share of your preferred policy. There's no reason why you might regret the outcome, at least at the first part. And more importantly, you're not really going to regret the process that produced your favored government. Losers, though, we expect them to be disappointed and displeased with an election result. What makes democracies unique is that losers do two things. They accept the decision of the election, and then they also agree to play again the next time. So they literally consent to be governed by people that they don't like. And they also consent to the same process that gave them an outcome that they didn't like as well. In this case, democracies are only viable when they secure a substantial portion of individuals who are displeased with the outcome of an electoral process. One of the things that we look at is the winner-loser gap on a number of indicators. So the distance between how satisfied and happy winners are versus how dissatisfied and unhappy losers are. And one of the things that we know when we look is that the effects are immediate. So the moment you go from being a winner to a loser, your support and indications on a number of things start to go down. For people who have been losers, the moment you win, your satisfaction increases, so on and so forth. These effects are immediate, but they also persist over a long period of time. So they're both immediate and long-lasting. So here's the thing. If you lose repeatedly, it erodes support for the political system, and in places that are transitioning to democracy, this is critical. But I would also contend that in Alberta, in a context where we don't change governments ever, we have a problem with how we think about elections and how we think about our democracy. One of the things that comes through comparative research is that reactions to winning and losing are moderated by both partisanship and ideology. So strong partisans, when they win, they're much more happy. When they lose, they are much more unhappy, and ideological extremists on both ends of the spectrum have a similar reaction as well. They're not universal, but when they're there, they're strong. Consistent exclusion of significant minorities of voters in democracies produces instability, and notably for Alberta, people who perceive that they have no chance of winning choose to exit. And if we're lucky, that means that they simply choose not to participate, rather than continuing to use their voice in the system. One of the reasons I look at Alberta, and we have chronically low voter turnout, and so things like competitiveness and all these other sorts of things, you would look at Alberta in 2015, and yeah, turnout did go up, but turnout was still low comparatively. And I think it's because we have so many people who, most of whom are progressive, who would have never imagined that they would have actually been able to see their preference in government, that they were like, why bother? And this is why I think you would also see people flocking to join a party for a leadership process, because, quote, this is the only way I'm going to have an influence on who gets to become premier of the province. We are used to this kind of malaise. Alberta has a problem with this. When electoral democracies don't regularly swap out incumbents with challengers, it produces malaise, both with respect to how individuals see or trust the system, and also in how its institutions function or how they are perceived to function. This is bad. This is, I'm sorry to be Debbie Downer here, but this is bad. This is my number one concern with Alberta, and it has been for quite some time, and it will continue to be. I'm teaching this class, and I was talking to my students about issue voting and when we pay attention to issues and when we don't, and a student raised their hand and said, well, 2015 was one where there was an issue. It was just a protest vote. And I was like, no, it's not. it was just an accidental victory. No, it's not. It's the same process that produces a government in Canada, not only in the province, but also in every other province and at the federal level. It wasn't an accident. Framing it that way suggests that Alberta has a natural governing party, and that is an abhorrence or an anomaly when we actually do what democracies do, which is change governments with challengers and change incumbents with challengers. This problem manifests itself in different ways, on the left and on the right. And I'm on the right. One of the things I noticed on social media immediately following the election were people who couldn't believe it, and they would comment and say to the Premier or to New Democrat MLAs, resign and call a new election, that's the best thing that you could do. And people will laugh, but this is the idea that those are voters who immediately rejected the legitimacy of the process. This alarms me. I think it should alarm everybody, but this alarms me. Other things that alarm me. I'm also a gender and politics scholar, so when this came out, this is from the Alberta Sheriff's, this is data from the Alberta Sheriff, who was doing protection from the Premier. We have very few threats of violence towards the leader of our government until 2015, and it gets worse in 2016, and I haven't seen data for 2017, but I would imagine it continues. And so the first question I get asked is it because Rachel Notley's a woman? And I say no, because, I mean, Alison Redford certainly has probably more than her fair share, more than Klein, and more than Stelmack. And I'm guessing gender does condition this, but I see the threats of violence as directly related to losers' consent. These are people who did not like the outcome of the election, and they will not consent to the democratic process. If we had a stronger democratic norm, or norms of democracy in Alberta, we would not see this. Notably, some of these people are the same ones that like to complain about Justin Trudeau, but most of the people who were really upset about the Conservatives losing in Alberta were willing to accept the same result later that year at the federal level. So there was more angst and more anger about changing governments in Alberta than there was in changing governments in Ottawa. And that's because the federal norms of democracy are more robust because we change governments every now and then. So when I hear things, I see this, and this alarms me, fair enough. But I mean, Jason Kenney knows how to speak to this particular crowd. This is his repeated referring to the NDP as an accidental government. This is not, I mean, I understand why he's doing it, it's good politics, but it really does undermine democratic institutions and processes when he's using that kind of language. If the idea about losers' consent is that everybody gets a hearing at least, and everybody gets a seat at the table every once in a while, this idea here, and the problem on the right with this, is that these are people who think that they monopolize the seat at the table. They think that it's only appropriate for them to have a seat at the table. For me, re-electing this particular incumbent government, and I'm using the term incumbent deliberately in this context, is critical to demonstrate that this wasn't an accident, this is something normal, and this is produced by our normal democratic institutions following their normal democratic processes. In order for that to happen, we have to talk about the problem with losers' consent on the left. I think people on the left, people who have never really felt represented well by the progressive conservatives, I know this is me for literally my entire life. The PCs were elected the year after my father immigrated, and so like on some level I'm like, they're as old as Dad is in Canada, or something along these lines, right? I think a lot of people struggle with the idea of being in the majority. It's more comforting to be in the silent majority than it is to actually be in the majority, because part of this involves power seeking. And so I know people are kind of uncomfortable with the idea of power seeking, but in this particular context, it's like, you do have a right to have the seat at the table. You do have the right to have your hands on the lever of power every now and then. And, you know, we just got them. And we're seeing governments are bound by the actions of previous governments. So, you know, you can see that changes are slow, and I'm sure there's things that everybody's seen from this particular government that we don't necessarily love, but this is something that comes from being in a context of government that happens across time. Things that we know about public opinion in Alberta. Public opinion research shows that I think progressive Albertans are in the majority. On average, Albertans are no more conservative than any other province in Canada. The #1 regional divide in public opinion in Canada is between Quebec and the rest of Canada on one issue: what should be done about Quebec. Should surprise no one. Regional variations between the West and the rest of Canada, so if we're looking at the prairies, are as the same size or smaller than public opinion differences across other social cleavages like gender, like age, income, and education. So, I think the left in Alberta struggles with the idea that it belongs in power and that it's okay to be in power. I think that we struggle with the idea that we might actually be the majority and that it's okay to demand that the government represent the majority. Albertans have been super ambivalent about social conservatism, and like that's at its worst for a really long time. Most of them are kind of like, yes, reproductive rights, that's fine. Environmental regulation, we should be doing that. This is stuff from the late 90s, for crying out loud. So the idea that we finally actually have a government that's systemically doing something about this is something that we should be like, yes, more of this, please, thank you. The other thing that I think we struggle with, though, and I think this is an Albertan thing, because our political history is one where when we don't like something, it's like our hobby is to just make a new political party. And many great political parties in Canada have come from this. Like if you look at the history of party development in Canada, it's usually somebody out west being angry. We know the CCF was formed in Legion Number 1, literally. So when we say that the Prairie Populism cuts across the ideological spectrum, it really does. One of the things I hear that I am sorry, I have to burst bubbles about this. Public opinion usually does sit in the center, but parties don't. And so I don't want to pick on the Alberta Party, but this is the idea, this rhetoric's pretty common. This is the idea of the way to win is sitting in the middle. There's also, one of the things I'm watching is to see whether or not this is a vehicle simply for old progressive conservatives. I don't necessarily think that's the case, but the media really likes to talk about it like that's the case. So one of the things I want to talk about is why the center is a place where parties don't win. And I'll finish with this because I know I'm over time. So I'm going to borrow from Maurice Duverger. He is a French political scientist, foundational in the field, the first to write a systemic book about women in politics back in 1955. So he's the guy who coined Duverger's law, like it's the closest thing to a law-like generalization that we have in political science. So forgive the publication date, but he's right about many things, and I believe he's right about this as well. Political choice is about alternatives. Political choice takes the form of a choice between alternatives. A duality of parties does not always exist, but there's always a duality of tendencies. He goes on to say this is the equivalent of saying there actually really isn't a center in politics. It doesn't exist. It's applied to a geometrical spot where moderates of opposed tendencies meet. Which makes sense. Fair. Every center is divided against itself and remains in two halves, the left center and the right center. For the center is nothing more than an artificial grouping of the right wing of the left and the left wing of the right. The fate of the center is to be torn asunder. If you look at American politics, it's a classic two-party system, and this is exactly what you see. This is exactly what you see. When we look at party identification in the United States, we measure it on a 0 to 7 scale, where you go from strong Democrat to strong Republican, you've got a true independent in the middle. There aren't any of them when you run the numbers in the National Election Study, or they're there, but they don't vote. And if you were thinking about the strategy, the best way to win, the argument would be you play to the fours. You'll bring the people along, all these other sorts of things. Even a casual observer in American politics will note this is not how this is playing out. This is not how it played out in 2008. It's not how it played out in 2012. And I'm thinking about the Tea Party in those contexts, not just presidential elections. And it's only getting worse from that point on. Now, the Americans have a particularly polarized system. Canadians could be forgiven for not necessarily intuitively getting this because the argument where the center actually ends up winning elections holds for Canadian federal elections. This is the Liberal Party of Canada. But the reason why they win is because of existential questions about the nature of Canada, specifically with respect to Quebec. So the Liberal Party of Canada is the party that advocates for Quebec, for Canada inside the province of Quebec, and for Quebec in the rest of Canada. What it means is that the other national competitor needs to advocate for Canada inside of Quebec, and anyway, it puts the Conservatives in a really awful spot, and they basically can't hold an electoral coalition together. This is Dick Johnson's career-building book. He's out at UBC. It's The Analytic History of the Canadian Party System. Everybody should read it. It just came out in September. I can understand that given this federal context, understanding that the center is not where you win an election is hard to understand. One of the things I would note is that Alberta has been a system of one-party dominance for my entire life and for recent memory. And we are starting to transition away from this. Our system genuinely incentivizes two-party competition. Again, Canada's weird for a variety of reasons, but Alberta simply has not had this for a really long time, if ever. And so this is one of these things, just like the word populism, I'm actually not all that worried about electoral polarization or partisan polarization, because you actually now have two choices. And our system is predicated on this. So you've got one side saying, here's our vision for government. You've got the other side saying, here's our vision for government. And the system literally forces them to give cogent versions of their bit of government. Note, this is starting to come out now, where you have very clear distinctions between these two parties. If you like public health care, it's not a good choice. If you like women's rights, there's kind of only one choice. Like the official opposition House leader fired an employee because she was sexually harassed. And some people are okay with that. Like, this is a very clear choice, right? So for me, there is a way forward. Winners who are not used to losing need to get used to it, because that's what happens in democracies. So Alberta has had a weak opposition for far too long. I would welcome strong opposition in this particular context, but we need to really break the idea that there's only one party that can govern this province and that anything else is just an accident. So that means on the right, like if there's any conservatives in the room, it's just like, I'm sorry, I understand losing is not very fun, but like, yes, you actually have to build the skill at losing and then organize and persuade people to vote for you, instead of insisting that it's actually just your natural position to be in. That's not how this works. For people who are genuinely in the center, the question or the challenge I would ask is if you are center left or center right, because that has implications for which side of this you organize on. And if you were genuinely in the middle, then the question I would ask is, okay, so, but what serves your interest best? The options that you have that's on the left, and the option that you have that's on the right. And to the left, I would say, get used to the fact that you actually do have the right to have a seat at the table. You do have the right to have your hands on the levers of power. Governing certainly is monumentally challenging. And it's especially challenging after decades of rule from another side. So the constraints are enormous, I understand that. But I think we need to be unapologetic about having a seat at the table. There's two other things I want to note. At this point, we actually have a progressive incumbent government. And so 2018 is literally going to be about getting them reelected or defeating them. That is literally the only calculation that's there. I don't really care about the partisan vehicles that are attached to that. Elections are about either re-electing incumbents or defeating them. More practically, what this means is that geography matters. And even though we've had redistricting, the way to a majority government is either through one city and rural districts or through both cities. Edmonton and the donut, I think they're probably still solidly New Democrat. This means that the electoral battleground is really going to, I'm from rural Alberta, I know how that's going to go. What that means is that Calgary is the place where things get interesting. And so for Calgarians, I would say, do you want to re-elect incumbents? Or re-elect incumbents, basically. Sorry, that's a really but that's all I got. Okay, thank you very much.